At 4:17 a.m. on August 6, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Arthur Brennan stood on the bridge of the USS Helm, staring at a navigation chart that was about to kill his entire crew. The chart showed open water ahead, clear passage through the Solomon Islands toward Guadalcanal. The fleet was scheduled to advance in 90 minutes. 12 destroyers, 4,000 men, all relying on this same chart. But Brennan had already lost one ship to these reefs. 6 days earlier, the USS Tucker had run aground on a sandbar that didn't appear on any U.S. Navy map. The impact tore a 12-foot gash in her hull. She sank in 40 minutes. 17 men drowned in water shallow enough to stand in. The Navy's official charts of the Solomon Islands were based on British surveys from 8 and A87. I'm 55 years old. The surveys had been done from surface observations. No depth soundings below 18 feet. And the reefs weren't static. Coral grew. Cyclones shifted sandbars. Channels silted over. The result? American destroyers were navigating one of the most treacherous waterways in the Pacific using maps that were older than the officers reading them. Naval intelligence knew this. Their directive was clear: advance with caution, reduce speed in unmarked shallows, deploy lead boats for sound. Brennan had tried that. It didn't work. Lead boats moved at 4 knots. The Japanese moved at 18. By the time you sounded a safe channel, the enemy had already flanked you. And reducing speed in contested waters meant becoming a stationary target for coastal artillery. The Fifth Fleet had grounded or damaged 11 vessels in the past month trying to navigate the Solomons. Most struck reefs in water that was charted as deep passage. Brennan had pulled bodies out of engine rooms flooded by reef strikes. Young men, engine crew, kids really. They'd climbed into those compartments trusting the maps were accurate. The maps were not accurate. Naval Command said the problem was insufficient caution during nighttime maneuvering. Brennan knew better. The problem wasn't the captains. It was the charts. The reefs around the Solomon Islands didn't follow predictable patterns. They weren't linear barriers you could sail around. They were mazes, subsurface coral ridges, volcanic rock shelves, channels that appeared at high tide and vanished at low tide. You couldn't chart them from a ship. The draft was too deep. You'd run aground before you detected the reef. You couldn't chart them from aerial reconnaissance. The water was too murky. Coral didn't show up in photographs unless it broke the surface. The Navy needed depth soundings taken by someone in a shallow draft boat who knew the reefs intimately, who had crossed them hundreds of times, who understood how the currents shifted them. The Navy needed local knowledge, but there was no official process for acquiring that. No protocol for integrating indigenous maritime intelligence into fleet navigation orders. That would require clearance from ComSubPac in Pearl Harbor. And Pearl Harbor was 4,200 miles away. So when a barefoot 17-year-old boy approached the reconnaissance team at Tulagi Island carrying a bundle of palm leaves covered in charcoal sketches, the Marines almost turned him away. His name was Kai Maleko. He spoke broken English. He'd never seen a sextant, never used a compass, never heard of latitude or longitude. But he'd drawn a map. Not a map in the way the Navy understood maps. No grid lines, no scale, no magnetic bearings. Just a hand-sketched web of lines and symbols showing coral ridges, deep channels, sandbars, and the places where boats die. The reconnaissance officer, Lieutenant Parker, glanced at it for maybe 8 seconds and handed it back. "We appreciate the effort, son, but we need real charts." Kai left the sketches anyway. That night, Brennan couldn't sleep. He went to the intel tent and found Kai's drawings in the discard pile. He unrolled them under a kerosene lamp. The lines were crude. The annotations were in a language Brennan didn't recognize. But there was something about the shapes, The way Kai had drawn the channels curving around the reefs, the notations marking tidal flows, the tiny symbols indicating depth changes. It looked like the reef through a fisherman's eyes. Brennan cross-referenced Kai's sketches against the Navy's official charts. Where the Navy showed open water, Kai had drawn a submerged ridge. Where the Navy showed a shallow bar, Kai had marked a navigable channel. One of those contradictions matched exactly where Tucker had gone down. Brennan did something that violated Navy protocol, inter-service intelligence regulations, and probably a dozen other rules he didn't have time to look up. He found Kai in the village, brought him onto the helm, sat him down with the navigator, and asked him to talk them through the routes. Kai didn't use nautical terms. He used stories. This channel is safe when the tide pulls from the east. But when the moon is full, the current runs backward, and the coral comes up to bite. This sandbar, the fish gather here at dawn. The water is shallow, but 10 canoe lengths to the north, you can pass even at low tide. The navigator, Ensign Mallory, translated Kai's stories into bearings and depth estimates. It took 4 hours. When they were done, they had a route, stitched together from a teenager's memory, scribbled onto a Navy chart in pencil. Brennan didn't tell command. He didn't file a report. He just plotted the course and gave the order. At 6:05 a.m., the helm entered the channel Kai had described. The fathometer showed 18 feet of water. The Navy chart said they should have run aground 2 minutes ago. They didn't. The helm threaded through a gap in the reef so narrow the crew could see coral on both sides. A passage invisible on every official map. It worked. Nobody said anything. There was no ceremony, no acknowledgement. But that night, 3 other destroyer captains quietly asked Brennan for a copy of that local boy's notes. By the end of the week, Kai's sketches, transcribed, annotated, and redrawn, were being passed between ships like contraband. On August 12th, Admiral Nimitz's staff issued Movement Order 47S, all available indigenous navigational intelligence to be compiled and distributed for operational use in the Solomon Island Theater. They never mentioned Kai by name, but for the next 6 months, every U.S. warship that threaded safely through the reefs toward Guadalcanal did so by following routes a 17-year-old fisherman had sketched in charcoal on palm leaves. What happened next would turn the tide of the Pacific War. But first, Brennan had to convince the fleet that a boy who'd never left his island knew more about these waters than the entire United States Navy. Kai Maleko was 17 years old when he drew his first reef chart. He didn't call it a chart. He called it Te Karanga o Te Moana, the voice out of the sea. He'd been fishing the waters around Tulagi Island since he was 6, 11 years, 412 weeks of watching tide patterns, tracking current shifts, memorizing the places where coral came within 3 feet of the surface at low tide. His father taught him the old way. Read the color of the water. Dark blue meant deep channels, safe for canoes, safe for crossing. Turquoise meant reef. Light turquoise meant the coral was close, maybe 2 or 3 feet down. Brown meant sandbar. If you saw white foam but no wind, there was submerged rock just beneath the surface. Listen to the sound. Fast water over the shallow reef made a hissing sound. Deep channels were silent. If you heard a low rumble, you were near a drop-off where the current pulled hard. Feel the pull. Currents had rhythm. At high tide, the water pushed east through the gap between Tulagi and Savo Island. At low tide, it pulled west. If you didn't know the rhythm, the ocean would drag you into the reef. By the time Kai was 14, he could navigate the 18-mile stretch between Tulagi and Guadalcanal in total darkness. No stars, no compass, no lantern. Just current, sound, and memory. He knew where the reef came up sharp, where a canoe could pass at dawn but not at dusk. He knew where the sand shifted after storms, closing old channels and opening new ones. He knew the places fishermen avoided, the places where boats had died, where wooden hulls had splintered against coral that didn't show on any map. Because there were no maps, not real ones. The British had surveyed the area in 1887, but they'd done it from the deck of a steam-powered survey ship with a draft too deep to approach the reefs. They recorded the major shipping lanes and called everything else hazardous shallows, uncharted. That was 55 years ago. In 55 years, cyclones had reshaped the sandbars. Coral had grown. Channels had silted over. The ocean had rewritten itself 100 times. And no one had updated the charts, except Kai. He didn't think of it as map-making. He thought of it as remembering. When he was 15, he started sketching the reef patterns on dried palm leaves using charcoal from the cooking fire. Not because anyone asked him to, just because it helped him think. He marked the deep channels with thick lines, the shallow reefs with clusters of dots, the places where the current reversed with small arrows, the sandbars that appeared only at low tide with wavy lines. His father saw the sketches once and laughed. "Are you trying to teach the ocean how to behave?" Kai smiled. "No, just trying to remember where it wants to go." His father nodded. "Good. The ocean doesn't listen to men. Men have to listen to it." Kai understood that. To the colonial officers who occasionally passed through Tulagi, the waters around the Solomon Islands were a navigational nightmare, a maze of invisible hazards that couldn't be trusted. To the U.S. Navy, these were uncharted territories, dangerous, unpredictable, enemy water. But to Kai, every ridge had a name, every channel had a story, every season had a season. The ocean wasn't a mystery to him. It was a memory, and in 1942, when the war came to the Solomons, that memory would become the only thing standing between the U.S. fleet and total disaster. Kai didn't know that yet. He was just a boy, sitting on a coral outcrop, sketching lines in the sand while his father's canoe drifted nearby. But the war was coming, and it would need him. In the spring of 1942, the U.S. Navy faced a new kind of enemy in the Solomon Islands. Not men, water. The Navy's charts of the region were based on British hydrographic surveys conducted in 1887, 55 years old. The surveys had been done from surface observation aboard steam-powered ships with drafts too deep to approach the reefs. Depth soundings were taken only in major shipping lanes. Anything shallower than 18 feet wasn't recorded. That meant thousands of submerged reefs, coral ridges, volcanic shelves, and shifting sandbars were completely unmapped. The result? American destroyers were trying to navigate some of the most treacherous waters in the Pacific using maps older than the officers reading them. On June 14, 1942, the USS Gregory scraped a submerged reef while attempting a nighttime insertion near Guadalcanal. The impact buckled her keel and cracked her fuel tanks. She leaked oil for 6 miles before making emergency repairs. She was out of action for 3 weeks. On July 9th, the USS Tucker ran aground on a sandbar that didn't appear on any chart. The impact tore a 12-foot gash in her hull below the waterline. She took on water fast, 4,000 gallons in the first 10 minutes. The pumps couldn't keep up. She sank in 38 minutes. 17 men drowned in water shallow enough to stand in. On July 24th, the USS Jarvis struck a submerged coral ridge while evading a Japanese bomber. She lost steering, took on water, limped back to port, and was out of commission for 6 weeks. Between June and August 1942, the Fifth Fleet grounded, damaged, or lost navigational capacity on 11 vessels trying to move through the Solomon Islands. 11 ships, 34 men dead, hundreds more injured, millions of dollars in repair costs, and the Navy still didn't have accurate charts. Naval Command issued a directive on July 30th. All vessels operating in unmarked shallows will reduce speed to 8 knots and deploy lead boats for depth sounding. It didn't work. Lead boats moved at 4 knots. The Japanese moved at 18. By the time you sounded a safe channel, the enemy had already repositioned. And reducing speed in contested waters meant becoming a stationary target for coastal artillery and bomber squadrons. You couldn't fight a war at 4 knots. The Navy needed real-time depth soundings. They needed someone who knew the reefs intimately, someone who'd crossed them hundreds of times, who understood how the currents shifted them, who could predict where coral rose and where channels deepened. They needed local knowledge, but there was no protocol for that. No official process for acquiring indigenous maritime intelligence. No forms to file. No chain of command to request it through. Integrating local navigational data into fleet movement orders would require clearance from ComSubPac in Pearl Harbor, verification from the Navy Hydrographic Office in Washington, and probably a dozen other approvals that would take weeks. And they didn't have weeks. The Japanese were fortifying their positions across the Solomon Island chain. Every day the U.S. fleet was delayed was another day the enemy dug in deeper. So the Navy did what it always did when the maps failed. It sent men forward anyway and hoped they'd survive. Destroyer captains navigated by guesswork. They watched the color of the water, listened for the sound of surf breaking over hidden reefs, and prayed the fathometer would give them warning before they hit. Sometimes it did. Often it didn't. Lieutenant Commander Arthur Brennan, captain of the USS Helm, had already lost 2 men when his ship nearly grounded on a reef that wasn't on the chart. He knew it was only a matter of time before the ocean swallowed another ship. He just didn't know the solution was about to walk into his camp barefoot, carrying a bundle of palm leaves. August 3, 1942. Tulagi Island, 2:14 p.m. A U.S. Marine reconnaissance team was setting up a forward observation post on the western shore when Kai Maleko approached their perimeter. I am 17 years old, barefoot, no shirt, holding a roll of dried palm leaves tied with braided coconut fiber. The sentry almost turned him away, but Kai spoke English. Broken, heavily accented, but functional. He'd learned it from Australian missionaries who'd passed through the island in the 1930s. He told the sentry he had something the Navy needed. The sentry radioed it in. Lieutenant Parker, the intelligence officer, told him to bring the kid up. Kai walked into the command tent and stood in front of a folding table covered in maps, compasses, and reconnaissance photos. Parker looked up. "You speak English?" "Yes, sir." "A little. What do you want?" Kai placed the rolled palm leaves on the table. "I have a map of the reef." Parker raised an eyebrow. He untied the fiber cord and unrolled the leaves. They were covered in charcoal sketches. Lines, symbols, dots, notations in a language Parker didn't recognize. No grid coordinates, no compass bearings, no scale markings. Parker studied it for maybe 8 seconds. He looked at Kai. "Where'd you get this?" "I made it." "You made this?" "Yes, sir." "What is it supposed to show?" "The reef. Where the water is deep, where it is not, where boats can pass, where they cannot." Parker glanced at the sketches again, then slid them back across the table. "We appreciate the effort, son, but we need real charts, official surveys. This is—" he hesitated. "This is native guesswork." Kai didn't argue. He just nodded, took the palm leaves, and turned to leave. But as he reached the tent flap, he stopped. "The Tucker," Kai said quietly. Parker looked up. "What about her?" "She sank 2 weeks ago, on the sandbar." "How do you know that?" "Everyone knows. We saw it. The sandbar is there every year when the tide is low. It is not on your maps." Parker stared at him. Kai pointed to the rolled palm leaves in his hand. "It is mine." Then he walked out. Parker didn't follow him. He had a patrol to coordinate. But the conversation stuck in his head. That night, Lieutenant Commander Arthur Brennan came by the intel tent looking for updated depth charts. Parker mentioned the local kid with the reef sketches. Brennan asked where the sketches were. Parker shrugged. I sent him away. It wasn't useful. Where are the sketches now? Probably in the trash. Brennan found them in the discard pile behind the tent. Crumpled, dirty, but intact. He brought them back to his quarters and unrolled them under a kerosene lamp. The drawings were crude. The annotations were in a language he didn't understand. But the shapes, the way Kai had drawn the channels curving around the reefs, the notations marking tidal flows, the depth symbols, they looked real. Brennan pulled out the Navy's official chart and laid it next to Kai's sketches. Where the Navy showed open water, Kai had drawn a submerged ridge. Where the Navy showed hazardous shallows, Kai had marked a navigable channel. And when Tucker had gone down, Kai had drawn a sandbar with a warning symbol. Brennan stared at the maps for a long time. Then he went to find the boy. August 6, 1942, 4:17 a.m. The USS Helm was scheduled to advance through the indispensable strait toward Guadalcanal at dawn. The Navy chart showed a direct route. Open water, estimated depth 40 feet, marked unverified. Brennan didn't trust it. He'd found Kai the night before and brought him aboard the Helm. The crew didn't ask questions. They assumed he was a local guide, maybe a scout. Brennan spread the Navy chart across the navigation table and asked Kai to show him a safe route. Kai studied the map for a long time. He didn't recognize the grid lines or the printed labels, but he recognized the shapes, the coastline, the islands, the gaps between them. He traced his finger along a path that curved north, looped around a cluster of small islands, then cut south through a narrow channel. This way, Kai said. Deep water. Safe. Ensign Mallory, the navigator, looked at the route. Then he looked at the Navy chart. Sir, that route takes us within 300 yards of the reef line. The chart says it's 18 feet deep, maybe less. We draw 17 feet fully loaded. Brennan looked at Kai. You're sure this is safe? Kai nodded. Yes, I cross here many times. Deep channel. The coral is far away. Mallory didn't look convinced. Sir, if he's wrong, we'll ground and block the strait, Brennan said. I know. He paused. Then he gave the order. Set course per the boy's route. Slow ahead. Continuous fathometer readings. If we hit 20 feet, full stop. At 6:05 a.m., the Helm entered the channel Kai had described. The fathometer read 32 feet, then 35, then 41. According to the Navy chart, they should have been in 18 feet of water. They should have grounded by now. They hadn't. The Helm glided forward. Moonlight reflected off the water. The crew could see the reef on both sides, coral ridges rising just beneath the surface, white foam breaking over submerged rocks. But between the ridges, the channel was deep. Plenty of clearance. Mallory called out the readings. 38 feet, 42, 39. The gap narrowed. The crew could see coral on the port side, maybe 60 feet away. Coral on the starboard side, maybe 70. Brennan stood on the bridge, watching the water, watching Kai. Kai stood near the helm, silent, eyes on the reef. The channel tightened further. 50 feet of clearance, then 40. Mallory's voice was tense. Sir, we're in a 30-foot wide corridor. If the current pushes us even slightly off course, steady as she goes, Brennan said. The helm moved forward, slow, controlled. Then suddenly the channel widened. The fathometer jumped to 60 feet, 70, 85. They were through. Mallory exhaled. The helmsman relaxed his grip on the wheel. Brennan looked at Kai. You've done this before? Kai nodded. Many times. In my father's canoe. In a canoe? Yes, sir. Brennan smiled faintly. Well, you just did it in a 1,500-ton destroyer. Nobody said anything after that. There was no ceremony, no congratulations. But word spread fast. By the time the helm reached the staging area, 3 other destroyer captains had already radioed Brennan asking for a copy of that route the local kid gave you. Brennan didn't file an official report. He just passed along Kai's sketches, copied onto Navy charts in pencil. By August 10th, 5 ships were using Kai's routes. By August 15th, it was 12. And by August 18th, Admiral Nimitz's staff had issued an order: compile every piece of local navigational knowledge you can find and integrate it into the fleet's movement plans. They didn't mention Kai by name, but his reef chart was about to guide the entire U.S. Navy into position for one of the most important battles of the Pacific War. By August 10, 1942, Kai Maleko's palm leaf sketches were being passed between destroyer captains like contraband. The problem was, they weren't standardized. No grid coordinates, no compass bearings, no depth markings in fathoms. Just visual landmarks and tidal instructions that only made sense if you'd spent your whole life fishing those waters. A Navy chart told you bearing 187 degrees, depth 40 feet, hazard at coordinates 9 degrees 160 degrees. Kai's chart told you when the current runs east and the water is the color of sky before rain, the channel is safe. The fleet couldn't navigate on poetry, so the Navy did something unusual. On August 12th, they assigned Chief Petty Officer Raymond Cole, a cartographer attached to the 5th Fleet's Hydrographic Survey Team, to sit down with Kai and translate his knowledge into something the fleet could actually use. Cole was a 34-year-old draftsman from Michigan who'd been making maps since 1935. He'd worked for the U.S. Geological Survey before the war. He knew charts, coordinates, and projections. But he'd never worked with someone like Kai. Cole brought Kai into the chart room aboard the USS Macaulay. He spread out the Navy's official maps of the Solomon Islands, big, detailed sheets marked with depth soundings, coastline tracings, and navigational warnings. Then he asked Kai to mark every reef, channel, sandbar, and depth change he knew. It took 6 days. Kai would point to a spot on the map and say, "Here, the water is deep, dark blue, safe for the big ships." Cole would ask, "How deep?" Kai would think, "Deep enough that I cannot see the bottom. Maybe 5 times the height of a man." Cole would convert that to fathoms, check it against the few accurate soundings the Navy had, and annotate the chart. Estimated depth 30+ feet. Local confirmation. Where Kai said shallow, Cole marked hazard zones. Where Kai said safe passage, Cole drew recommended navigation routes. Where Kai described tidal changes, this channel is deep at sunrise but shallow by midday, Cole noted the tidal variation and calculated the depth range. They cross-referenced Kai's memory against every verified data point the Navy had. And every time they checked, Kai was right. On August 14th, a survey boat went out to verify one of Kai's channels. The Navy chart said it was 18 feet deep, too shallow for destroyers. Kai said it was deep. The survey team took soundings: 42 feet at high tide, 36 at low tide. Kai was right. The Navy chart was wrong. Cole sent a report to the Fleet Hydrographic Office. Indigenous source has provided navigational intelligence of exceptional accuracy. Recommend immediate integration into operational charts. On August 16th, Cole had compiled Kai's knowledge into what he called an unofficial Indigenous reference chart, a hybrid document that combined Kai's local routes with the Navy's grid system, depth measurements, and magnetic bearings. He marked it confidential, for operational use only. Source: local indigenous knowledge, unverified by formal survey. Then he sent it up the chain of command. On August 18th, Admiral Chester Nimitz's staff issued Movement Order 47S, all available indigenous navigational intelligence to be compiled and integrated into operational charts for the Solomon Island Theater. Fleet commanders are authorized to use local depth knowledge where formal surveys are unavailable. The order didn't mention Kai by name. It didn't credit him. It didn't even specify where the intelligence had come from. It just said, use it. And the fleet did. Within a week, Kai's reef routes, transcribed, gridded, and redrawn by Cole, became the navigational foundation for every U.S. movement order in the region. They called it an unofficial reference, but in practice, it was the only map that actually worked. And it was about to guide 12,000 men and 43 ships safely through one of the most dangerous waterways in the Pacific, straight into the battle that would turn the war. August 21st, 1942. 11:32 p.m. 12 U.S. destroyers entered the waters off Guadalcanal using routes that Kai Maleko had sketched in charcoal on palm leaves. They moved in single file, no running lights, radio silence, moon low on the horizon. Every turn, every depth change, every narrow passage, predicted by a 17-year-old boy who had never seen a compass, never plotted a bearing, never heard of magnetic declination. The lead ship was the USS Helm, with Lieutenant Commander Brennan on the bridge and Kai standing beside him, quiet, watching the water. Brennan had the route memorized by now, but he wanted Kai there anyway, just in case. The fleet navigated through corridors in the reef that were 70 feet wide, 60 feet, in some places 50. Coral ridges rose within 8 feet of the surface on both sides, close enough that crew members on deck could see the phosphorescence of fish scattering over the reef in the moonlight. One wrong calculation, one misread current, 1 degree off course, and the lead ship would have grounded, blocking the entire column behind it. But the routes were flawless. The destroyers glided through the shallows like they'd been sailing these waters for years. Because, in a way, they had. Kai had crossed these reefs since he was 6 years old. 412 weeks. Thousands of passages. He knew where the coral grew, where the channels deepened at high tide, where the sand shifted after cyclones, where the current pulled hard and where it went slack. The Navy had maps. Kai had a memory. And tonight, for the first time in the Pacific War, that memory was guiding an entire battle group into position. At 1:47 a.m., the fleet cleared the final reef passage and entered the deeper waters off Lunga Point. Brennan turned to Kai. "We're through." Kai nodded. He didn't smile. He just looked out at the dark water and said quietly, "The ocean let you pass." Brennan didn't know how to respond to that. He just nodded. By 3:15 a.m., the entire fleet was in position. 43 ships, 12,000 men, positioned perfectly along the northern approach to Guadalcanal. Positions the Japanese didn't think were accessible. Channels the enemy assumed were too shallow for destroyers. Approaches that weren't on any map. The Japanese had fortified the southern beaches, expecting the U.S. to attack from the open water routes, the ones that appeared on the old British charts, but the U.S. fleet hadn't used those routes. They'd used Kai's. At 6:14 a.m., as the sun broke over the horizon, the U.S. Navy opened fire, and the Battle of Guadalcanal began. Back on Tulagi, Kai sat on the same coral outcrop where he used to sketch the reefs. He could hear the distant rumble of naval guns, see flashes of light on the horizon. He didn't know if the Americans would win, but he knew they'd made it through the reef, and that, at least, was something he understood. His father's canoe drifted nearby, tied to a rock with frayed rope. Kai watched the ocean, the way the current moved, the way the light reflected off the surface. The Navy had asked him how he knew where the channels were. He'd tried to explain. You listen to the water, you watch the color, you feel the pull of the tide. But they didn't really understand. They thought knowledge came from instruments, from surveys and sounding lines and charts printed on paper. Kai's knowledge came from a different place. It came from watching his father navigate by moonlight, from capsizing his canoe on a sandbar when he was 8 and learning where the coral hid. From 1,000 quiet mornings on the water, listening to the sea tell him where it was safe to go, the Navy had power. But Kai had understanding, and tonight, understanding had been enough. August 22nd, 1942, 6:14 a.m. The USS Quincy fired the first salvo, 16-inch guns, high-explosive shells. The sound rolled across the water like thunder tearing the sky apart. Within seconds, the entire U.S. fleet opened fire. 43 ships, over 300 naval guns. A wall of coordinated firepower directed at Japanese positions along the northern shore of Guadalcanal. The Japanese weren't ready. They'd fortified the southern beaches, the ones facing the open water approaches shown on the old British charts. They'd positioned coastal artillery to cover the routes they thought the Americans would use. But the U.S. fleet hadn't come from the south. They'd come from the north. Through reef channels the Japanese assumed they were impassable for destroyers. Through waters so shallow and complex that no navy in its right mind would try to navigate it at night. Except the U.S. Navy had, because a 17-year-old fisherman had shown them where the deep water was. The first wave of shells hit the Japanese command post at Lunga Point. The second wave hit the airfield. The third hit the ammunition depot. By 6:30 a.m., the entire northern shore was engulfed in smoke and fire. The Japanese scrambled to reposition their coastal guns, but it was too late. The U.S. fleet had already achieved total tactical surprise. They were firing from positions the enemy hadn't anticipated, from angles the enemy hadn't prepared for. The bombardment lasted 93 minutes. When it was over, the shore installations were destroyed. The airfield was cratered. The ammunition depot was still burning. At 8:47 a.m., the first wave of U.S. Marines hit the beach. They met scattered resistance, disorganized, shell-shocked Japanese defenders trying to regroup after the bombardment. But the beachhead held. By noon, 11,000 Marines were ashore. By the end of the day, the U.S. had secured a foothold on Guadalcanal, the first major offensive operation against the Japanese in the Pacific War. And it had started with a perfect naval approach through waters everyone said were unnavigable. Back on Tulagi, Kai watched the horizon glow orange with fire. He could hear the low rumble of the guns, feel the vibrations in the coral beneath him. He didn't understand war, didn't understand why men came from the other side of the world to fight over islands that didn't belong to them. But he understood the reef. And he knew the Americans had made it through because they'd listened. Not to their instruments, not to their charts, to him. That was strange, powerful, uncomfortable. Kai's father sat beside him, mending a fishing net. "They used your maps," his father said quietly. Kai nodded. "Will they win? I don't know. But they made it through the reef." "Yes." His father tied off a knot in the net. "Then you did what you could." Kai didn't respond. He just watched the smoke rising on the horizon. He thought about the American officers bent over his sketches, tracing the lines with their fingers. He thought about the ships gliding through the channels in the dark. He thought about the weight of all those men trusting water they couldn't see, currents they didn't understand. He thought about how fragile it all was. One mistake, one miscalculated tide, one shifted sandbar, and the entire fleet could have grounded. But it hadn't. The ocean had let them pass. Kai didn't know if that meant the Americans were right or if the ocean just didn't care. He only knew that the reef had spoken. And for one night, the U.S. Navy had learned to listen. The Battle of Guadalcanal would last 6 months. It would become one of the most brutal, grinding campaigns of the Pacific War. But it started with a perfect approach, a surprise landing, a foothold that changed everything. And none of it would have been possible without a boy who knew how to read the sea. After Guadalcanal, the U.S. Navy continued using Kai Maleko's routes for the next 8 months. His reef charts, transcribed, gridded and annotated by Chief Petty Officer Raymond Cole, were copied and distributed to every destroyer squadron operating in the Solomon Islands theater. Fleet navigators called them the indigenous charts. Informally, some captains called them the local routes. A few called them the fishermen's maps. Nobody called them Kais. On September 3, 1942, a supply convoy used one of Kai's channels to deliver ammunition and medical supplies to Marines holding the Guadalcanal beachhead. The route cut 12 hours off the standard approach time. On October 11th, a damaged destroyer limped through one of Kai's shallow-water routes to escape a Japanese pursuit. The enemy ships didn't follow. They assumed the water was too shallow. It wasn't. On November 18th, a troop transport carrying 1,500 reinforcements navigated safely through a storm using Kai's tidal flow markers. The Navy chart would have sent them straight into a reef. Kai's knowledge saved ships, saved lives, shaped the tempo of the entire campaign, but his name never appeared in any report. Movement Order 47-S, the directive that authorized the use of local navigational intelligence, credited indigenous sources but didn't specify who those sources were. The cartographers who transcribed Kai's routes were commended for exceptional chart accuracy under combat conditions. Kai wasn't mentioned. When fleet commanders filed after-action reports praising the newly updated navigational charts, they thanked the hydrographic office, the survey teams, and the logistics staff. Kai's name never came up. On February 9, 1943, the U.S. Navy declared the Solomon Islands campaign a strategic success. Admiral Nimitz issued a commendation to the Fifth Fleet for superior operational planning and navigational precision. Kai wasn't invited to the ceremony. He didn't even know there was one. By the time the war ended in 1945, Kai's original palm leaf sketches had disappeared. They were never catalogued, never archived, probably thrown away after Cole's team finished transcribing them. The official Navy charts that incorporated Kai's routes were filed in the Hydrographic Office under Survey Updates, Solomon Islands Theater, 1942-1943. No attribution, no acknowledgement, just updated depth markings and route annotations that quietly replaced the 55-year-old British surveys. In 1946, officers and admirals returned home to ticker tape parades and medal ceremonies. Kai returned to fishing. Nobody interviewed him. No reporters came to Tulagi asking about the local boy who helped the fleet, because nobody outside a few destroyer captains and one cartographer knew he'd helped at all. In 1952, a Navy historian researching the Guadalcanal campaign found a reference in a declassified logistics report. Navigational routes derived from local indigenous charts, unverified sources, remarkable accuracy. The historian tried to track down who had provided the chart. The file didn't say. He contacted the Hydrographic Office. They had no record of the original source material, just the updated charts. He reached out to veterans of the Fifth Fleet. A few remembered a local kid who knew the reefs. None remembered his name. One officer, Lieutenant Commander Brennan, retired, said he thought the boy's name was Kai, or maybe Kia. He wasn't sure. The trail went cold. Kai Maleko died in 1985 at the age of 60. He never left the Solomon Islands, never spoke publicly about the war, never tried to claim credit for what he'd done. When his children asked about the Americans, he said he'd helped some sailors find their way through the reef. That was all. He didn't tell them his maps had guided an entire fleet into battle. He didn't tell them the U.S. Navy had used his routes for 8 months. He didn't tell them his sketches had been copied, filed, and integrated into the official navigational record of the Pacific War. He just said he'd shown them where the water was deep, and then he went back to fishing. History remembered the admirals, the battles, the ships, but not the boy who showed them where to sail. In 1987, a U.S. Navy historian named Dr. Ellen Marsh was compiling an oral history of the Guadalcanal campaign when she found a reference in a faded logistics memo. Local indigenous navigational intelligence, exceptional accuracy, source unattributed. She'd seen dozens of references like that. The Pacific War had relied heavily on local knowledge: coast watchers, scouts, translators, guides. But this one was different. This one had been used to navigate an entire fleet. She spent 3 months trying to track down the source. She contacted the Naval Hydrographic Office. They had the updated charts from 1942, but no record of who'd provided the original reef data. She reached out to surviving veterans of the Fifth Fleet. Most were in their 70s by then. A few remembered a local boy with reef sketches. None remembered his name. She found Raymond Cole, the cartographer, living in a retirement home in Michigan. He was 81 years old. She asked him about the indigenous charts. Cole smiled. "You mean Kai's maps?" "Kai? Kai Maleko. I am 17 years old. Barefoot kid from Tulagi. Knew those reefs better than any chart I'd ever seen." "Do you know what happened to him?" Cole shook his head. "Lost track of him after the war. I always meant to go back. Thank him. Never did." Dr. Marsh flew to the Solomon Islands in 1988. She went to Tulagi, asked around, found a few elders who remembered the name. Kai Maleko, fisherman, died 3 years earlier. She met his daughter, Lani, who was 52. Dr. Marsh explained why she was there. Told her that Kai's reef charts had guided the U.S. fleet during the Battle of Guadalcanal. Lani looked confused. "My father never said anything about that. He never told you?" "No, he just said he helped some American sailors once. We thought he'd given them directions or something." Dr. Marsh showed her a copy of the 1942 movement orders. Dozens of ships, thousands of men, all navigating routes derived from Kai's knowledge. Lani stared at the documents for a long time. Then she smiled, quietly. "That sounds like him. He never talked about himself." In 1989, Dr. Marsh published a paper, Indigenous Navigational Intelligence and the Guadalcanal Campaign, The Unattributed Contributions of Kai Maleko. It was read by about 200 naval historians. It didn't make the news, didn't change any textbooks, but it put Kai's name in the record. And that was something. Today, if you visit Tulagi, you'll find a small memorial near the old docks. It was built in 1995 by the local community, with funding from a group of U.S. Navy veterans who'd served in the Solomons. The plaque reads, "In memory of Kai Maleko, 1925–1985, fisherman and navigator, whose knowledge of the reef guided the U.S. fleet during the Battle of Guadalcanal. His maps were never published. His name was never printed. But for one brief moment in 1942, the entire U.S. Navy sailed by the light of his understanding." Beneath the plaque, there's a rusted anchor from a World War II destroyer, half buried in coral. And on calm days, local fishermen still teach their children the old way: how to read the color of the water, how to listen for the sound of current over coral, how to feel the pull of the tide. They say the ocean has a voice, and if you listen carefully, it will tell you where it's safe to go. Kai Maleko spent his whole life listening. He didn't need recognition, didn't need medals or parades. He just needed to know he'd done what the ocean asked of him. He listened, he remembered, and when the moment came, he shared what he knew. That was enough, because in the end, he didn't conquer the sea. He understood it, and that's how he helped change the war.